Well, hello. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are, whenever you're watching this, for me. As is the norm, for when I have norms, it's noon on a Saturday. This particular Saturday, July 17th, 2021. And it occurs to me that maybe I have the wrong video title. Let me go check that really quick. Let's go ahead and throw up the desktop. I'm gonna take a look at this. Yes, that's the wrong title. My bad. It is July 17th, not July 9th. But there we go. Excellent. So, welcome to the show. Today we're going to talk about test context. And this has been one of those features that has been off and on requested. The issue that I have open for this is now 6 years old almost. I don't think that was the first time anybody's asked for it. I mean, XUnit used to be on Codeplex. We did not move any of the issues really over from Codeplex to GitHub. So it's possible that not only is that not the oldest one in GitHub, but there might have been some before in Codeplex. So what is exactly a test context? So the idea behind a test context is that you will be able to have access to more information about the test, information about the test itself, within the context of things that are perhaps the test itself or maybe test adjacent. So let's go take a look at the description of this. So there you go. There's test status. That's from April of 2015. Possible to know the status of the currently executed test, 416. Possible to get the name context of the running test, 416. Both of those sort of are test context. So the question is, I have to know if my test failed or not. My dispose method, for example, to take a screenshot. This seems to be the common request, which is I want to know if my test failed because I want to do something in the dispose when my test failed. I want to write a log. I want to write a screenshot, something else. There is a related issue which has to come after test context if it's something we take up. A related request, which is, can I attach information to the test result? So screenshot is a perfect example, right? Like we obviously don't have screenshotting built into XUnit.net, but somebody who's using XUnit.net as a base to take advantage of the execution framework and the runners, but wants to do UI automation tests, probably wants the ability to take a screenshot. And then they want the ability to associate that screenshot with the test. That's not the part we're going to design today, but in my estimation, you need the test context, A, to be able to take the screenshot, but also B, if we're going to give you a place to put things, it's going to be through the test context. So that's where that has to go. Today, you can dependency inject test output helper to get access to basically write text into the output of the test result. This is in some ways sort of a poor version of attaching content to the test result. Poor for a couple of reasons. One is that it's only text, and two is that the interface by definition is very limited. It's basically the equivalent of a write line. So you have to give us an entire line of text at a time. And we made the decision back in V2 days when we added test output helper because we wanted to be able to report real-time test output to the runners. And if the API was too chatty, that was difficult. So we may be able to improve that in v3. At the moment, that interface still is the same. There might be an issue open relating to improving test output. But one of the other things we did in v2 that was a change from v1 is we stopped capturing standard output, standard error, trace, and debug, which are the 4 typical sources of things that people consider to be output. There's also issues open about, how we might be able to re-enable that for people who want it. The reason we disabled it was when you start overriding things, it becomes very hard to test the thing you're overriding. So if you have stolen away standard out, then it's very difficult for you to test things that got written to standard out, as an example, or things that got written to trace, things that got written to debug. So if we're to bring back the ability to capture, it would be an opt-in thing. It would not be on by default. All right, so back to test context. Let's see. So here's an example of taking a screenshot if the thing is broken. So let's see, +1 for being able to do this. So there's an example of NUnit, which has test context as a static. A bunch of people saying +1. Claire offering some workarounds. My use case is conditional drop of integration test data. If the test fails, I want to investigate and so avoid dropping the test database. This doesn't actually seem like a useful version of why you need test context, but it'll be enabled anyway. Workaround describing the link, solve my use case. So this is a workaround. I actually haven't looked at this. So someone is basically wrapping their own try-catch around the test methods. Yeah, that's not really a great workaround. I mean, it works, but then discussions on thread static versus async local and whether we want things to be static. And of course, this was back in V2 days. So we're talking about target platforms and things not being available. So let's see. This is me saying we're going to put it in 3.0. And then Simon has an implementation of something that kind of works, but it, of course, requires global setup and some exception capturing mechanism, which presumably only, I don't know. I'll have to look and see what he did, just to see what's out there. Much preferable to expose test context being async local rather than dependency injection. I think I test output helper should be part test context for easy access. So then this is new conversations. One of the things that I'm interested in understanding from the community is, like one of the biggest feature requests, bigger than adding test context, is supporting dependency injection. So I'm really surprised by the pushback in here, which is I hate dependency injection. Give me those good old evil statics. And I don't like statics. Everywhere I look around .NET, statics have been going away. And the example I give here is http://context.current and ASP.NET. I was there when we were having the discussions about this for what became ASP.NET Core. And, the hassle of testing things which are static. Maybe this is maybe this is really only a problem for me, because I'm the one who has to test context. Nobody else has to test it; they just have to use it. Whereas at http://context.current, they would be writing tests for their ASP.NET apps, and you can't easily replace a static without doing, either an interface replacement or using the profiler APIs to inject code at runtime, neither of which is particularly awesome. So maybe my objection here isn't as strong as other people, because I'm in the unique place of knowing that you're going to be using these in a test. You're not going to need to be replacing them in a test. So that said, I'm definitely going to go down the dependency injection path to begin with, because it's the easier path for me to start coding against, and then worry about the statics later. And I want to have some thought about whether or not, if we do statics, whether or not we actually need both or not. From a consuming perspective, static context. So so a bunch of people saying static context. Fine. Let's go take a look at what Simon has here. So this enable exception capture that he shows, I'm curious to know exactly what he's doing. Right, so context. So what is exception? It's an internal. So this is the context object. This must be where it gets captured. Yep, enable exception capture, which is a static. And then we need a local. Domain current domain first chance exception, blah, 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 blah. If local value is null, return. If local value flush, return. Local value exception is exception. Sure. We have a init. So he's also using this to capture trace and debug and standard out and standard error. And then has also provided statics, right line for this. Flush clears the async local. If context is null, throw, there's no context flush. Sure. We'll get it. If there's not one there, then throw, then push it in there. So dynamically create it. Register, test output helper. Just context log messages. Don't know what he's going to do with the log messages. So the context had access to some things that I'm a little curious to understand how it got access to them, like the current test. So from an API perspective, you get access to the exception. If you have the context, you get access to the write, some write values and write line. Okay, flush. So partial. So where do you get current test from? See, so I test is a test. Init test. Get the test method. Okay, how am I getting the test method? Okay. So peeking inside and grabbing a private field off of ITest output helper. Okay. So basically you need to get initialized with the test output helper somewhere here. Test output helper has not been set. It's possible to call the XUnit context register is missing, or the current test does not inherit from XUnit context base. So they have a base class, which is their preferred way to do this, which is a protected constructor with ITest output helper. Interesting that they're using source file here. Use parameters. Parameters for what? What does use parameters do? It's weird. So go to the test method, get the parameters. Turn empty. Convert the test parameters into parameter class. I'm actually going to serialize instead pass and simple. I don't know how this is used. Yeah, so I'm going to ignore it for the moment. All right, so back to XUnit context base. So they're basically mandating that you do output helper, and then you do a context register on the output helper, and then the source file, which I assume they use inside the context. Okay. Nothing too surprising here. All right. So I started sort of sketching out what this interface might look like. And this is just the beginning, bear in mind. Now, this is not the full version of everything. But if I were to say, what are the things that I want from a test context? I would want access to the test case, right? That will let me know where I am. Maybe the test as well. All right, so that would be ITest. All right. And actually, test output helper is per test and not per test case. But anyway, we'll start sketching this out. And then the test case state. So this is new. Test case state is going to be information about the running test. Most of this information is not available until the test is finished running. So the first thing you need to know is, what state are we in? We might not be started yet. We might be running, and then we might be passed, failed, or skipped. Can't think of any others, but obviously we leave ourselves open to other options here, but those seem to be basically the states. Haven't started yet, started, finished with our 3 classic potential states. Okay, so most of this is not going to be available while you're not started or running. Some of this is only available if you fail. So good example here, these are the 3 things, the 4 things, I guess, which describe the exception that was thrown that caused failed tests. So that's going to be, because we do embedded, we have exception messages, parents, stack traces, and the actual exception types. Why do we take whole exception objects? Because we're running across app domain and or process boundaries, in which, well, in this case it'd be 3 AB process boundaries, in which case there's no guarantee that the type of the exception that was thrown would be something that we would be able to see on the other side. in fact, probably would not, because even the exceptions thrown by XUnit itself aren't available, by the assertion library, aren't available in the runners, because there's a very strong delineation between, what happens on the runner side over here and what happens where the tests are actually running over here, the execution side. Right? That strong delineation is everything that sits in XUnit v3 core over here on the execution side, and then the core reference to the assertion library. All that stuff sits over here. None of that stuff sits over here because the runners are version independent. And in fact, don't know anything about the best that they know is what version of XUnit you're running, what major version of XUnit you're running, and how to talk to something that runs that. Other than that, they don't know anything. After you're done, how long did you run? This will be 0 if you were skipped. Otherwise, it'll return a positive number, which is an approximation of the time spent running in seconds after we have finished running. So if you're still running, you'll get null. All right, get 0 for skipped, positive number for anything else. Failure cause, this is new in v3. This is something that I did not just introduce, but introduced apparently 34 days ago, according to this. And so the change that this was put into would be here. Adds failure clause to the test failed. So this is the message that's normally sent to runners, right? So this is not a message that would exist on the execution side, but the test failed object is the message that's sent from the execution engine to the runner engine to say, hey, we failed, and here's why, right? And this is new in v3. So generally speaking, all of the things being equal, if we don't know whether one of the other two is true, we just say you threw an exception. Because generally speaking, failing a test is throwing an exception. It's just that in the case of assertion exceptions, we have done some logic to say, hey, I'm an assertion exception. So you can specialize that and say this exception was thrown because it was an assertion failure. The thing that people were more interested in was the exception that gets thrown because we timed out. Both of these are done by convention. You have to implement an interface named iAssertionException. I don't care where it lives. I don't care what namespace it's in. But if your exception implements that interface, it gets an assertion exception. Same with iTestTimeoutException. You implement that interface. I don't even care what's in that interface because we won't use anything with it. It's just a marker, a way to mark basically your exception with metadata in a way that doesn't force you, if you're writing an assertion library, to link against XUnit just to get these interfaces, which is why it's an interface by name convention and not strict interface by type, or what would seem more appropriate would be like an attribute. But again, an attribute would require someone to take a strong type reference against XUnit v3. That we don't want to do that. All right, so back to test case status. All right, so we talked about that. Test case state has the failure cause, has the output, which will be null if you haven't run or you're still running, and will be not null, so at least an empty string after you have finished, regardless of what state you finished in. Okay, so that's kind of the current thinking on the shape of these interfaces. These are obviously going to evolve, and now that we're sort of here, I feel like these things that all say case should say test. So this is actually going to be an iTest. And this is going to be a test. And this should already be just test output helper. This test case state should really be called test state. Current state of a test. Okay. And you should be test state. Okay, so it gets current state of the test. Will only be available when test is not null. Gets the output helper can be used to add output to the test. It will only be available when test is not null. And gets the current test. The engine is currently in the process of running a test. I know it's silly for me to care about how this is wrapped, but whatever. Will return null outside of the context of a test. All right. So that's kind of the lowest layer of stuff. Will we get access to upper layers of stuff? Maybe, and that's kind of, later. But I think right now this is the best place for us to start because it's the bottom of the stack. So if you have a test, you can climb the stack. So there's a climb up to test case, right? And then there's a climb up to test method. And then there's a climb up to test class. And then there's a climb up to test collection and a climb up to test assembly. Right, so you can walk all the way up the stack from a test if you need to. So why might we want things in test context that aren't tests? What we really want is the ability to use this in more places than just a test and things that are immediately adjacent to tests. So there are things that will last longer than a test. For example, let's say I class fixture. Right, so if you have an I class fixture, these things have a lifetime which is tied to the test class and not to the test or the test case, as it may be. So if you were to take and use test context from within I class fixture, the question really becomes, what is the actual state of the test at that point in time, the engine at that point in time? So like if you're in a constructor of the class fixture, in that hierarchy of stuff that I just showed, the furthest down in that hierarchy you could get would be test class, as an example. You might not even get to test class yet, because like from a creation perspective, right, class fixtures are created before the test class because they're dependency injected into the test class. So even in a constructor, you might I would have to look at from a creation point of view, can you get access to the metadata about a test class even if the test class instance doesn't exist yet? So, right, so if I were to go look at iTest class, it gives you the type and the collection it belongs to and its unique ID, but you don't get access to the instance of the class. So that's going to be the other interesting thing right now, which is do we add the ability to get access to instances from these things? Because if you have access to the test context, maybe you want to go look at a value. Like let's say you're in a before/after attribute, right? And you're trying to clean up, and you want to go grab values out of the test that you just were running. So that instance of the test class, should we give you access to that? I don't know. It's a good question. One of those things we're going to have to address when we get there. Let's see. What else should we talk about? I think that's a good place to start. Oh yeah, the other thing that's probably missing there is other metadata about the test. So, for example, we have a display name here. And one of the ways a display name is calculated is based on the parameters that are being passed into the test. But you don't get access to the parameters here. So that's another question of, are we missing metadata here? Is there a value to being able to have access to the parameters that are going into the test? Right. All right. So lots of things to think about. Probably not going to take any notes on that yet. I have my note file available and ready. That looks like about it in terms of, where we're going to start in terms of implementation. And now that I'm thinking about this, like from a dependency injection perspective versus a static accessor perspective, I started making objects that would I thought I renamed this. I did not rename that. I need that to get renamed. I need that to get renamed. Okay. This is now test. I'll put this silly little clone down here, but actually I'm going to take it away for right now. It's definitely Yagni. So I have this object with test context. The clone is actually a hint about one of the things I've been thinking about, and so one of the things I'm thinking about is as you progress to each layer further down, like you can imagine I have a test context when I start running an assembly, but the only thing that's valid inside of it is assembly. If I inject that, then the question I have is, I have to mutate that object then, right? As I drill further down the stack, I have to mutate that object, right? Because if you imagine that all the way up that stack of hierarchy that we looked at, that I have test, test case, test method, test class, test collection, test assembly, right? That's 7 things. So there's 7 layers of which these things could exist. And at any given time, they may or may not be valid. So if I go down the dependency injection route, then what it implies is that the thing that I give to you at construction time is mutable, right? Its access to the current test basically comes into being as that test is being executed and then goes away. It would have to then go away after the test stops executing. And actually, I don't like that. The clone here was sort of an indication of my thinking that, over time, as we make new ones of these, like as I dive down each layer, that I would make a new object that just had more stuff. And I would give you a more filled out object instead of mutating the object you already had. And so if we don't do dependency injection, but but we end up doing static accessor instead, and that's backed by async local of t, for example. What that means is that the thing that gets returned back at any given time could be different because you may be at different stages of the execution engine. So if you call test context current, and we haven't even started enumerating test collections yet, then you get a version of test context that only has access to the assembly. But if we've started executing a test collection, and you call test context current, then you'll get a different object that is local to that particular context. Yeah, you get an object that's local to that context. That has access to now both the test assembly and the test collection. So how would that look in terms of my async local? So I'd have a static async local. All right, so let's actually just sort of start sketching this out in code. All right, so if I have a static read-only async local of something local, right? We don't know what the something is, but let's start assuming it's an async local of test context. Then we do public static test context current. Right, and then we do this, which is basically say local dot what? Yeah. All right, if local dot value is equal to null, then we need to put that thing in there, right? Let's do this. Let's say local, no try get value, huh? It's fine. Context is a default of test context. Actually, now let's do this. Local.value. All right. If context is null, then context is a new one of those. We need to fill it out somehow. I'm actually not sure how we would fill it out. Let's just assume that I can't always fill it out. All right. So let's say get is local value. Set is local value is value. That will be an internal set. Can I implicitly convert this? Okay, yeah, that's fine. Guard argument not null, name of card value, so that'll give me a not null version of that. Now you're telling me you cannot implicitly convert an iTest context to a test context. Fine. So if I were to do this, then basically it relies on me to come by and set test context current at various points of time. Say, hey, here's your value. Knowing that we're going to have a hierarchy of these things, what that basically means is one of two things. Either this needs to keep track of state, and we need to have like a stack, like a push-pull, and then this becomes a peak. Or whoever does this call to set needs to track the previous value, so that whenever what they're doing is done, they can reset the value back to the old value. And since that's going to be a lot of places, that makes me feel like I want this. Right, which means we just have a getter. And then we say basically if local value is null, local value is new. Let me say local value peak. So that would throw if there's nothing there. We don't have a try peek, huh? We have a count. So I'll get you the current context. And then we would want helpers, internal static, void push on test context. I think that would be do this. Stack, right? Do this. This is going to be our okay. So now this can basically just be this. All right, which means we can go ahead and do this. And then here we can do stack, push. Okay. Now the tracking is all here. Okay. We really only have one place where this is going to live, which is going to be the test invoker. Probably test invoker of T. Although, let's see, who calls the test invoker? Actually, the answer is who calls the XUnit test invoker? It's the XUnit test runner. You have a test here, which is also a test runner of T. So who invokes this? This is going to be test case runner. You don't have a test until we say create test runner, but it does exist at that point. This is where it comes into being. Now, create test runner is a virtual. So I'm not super stoked about putting the behavior of tracking all that stuff here, because it's an extensibility point. I could put it here, Interestingly, this is an override. It's not sealed. So I'm reluctant to put it here. Create test is another virtual. So I don't want to put it there either. Seems like the closest I want to go here is like if I were to say create test runner internal, which has all of these things on it. All right. And even though I don't really expect exceptions to be coming through here, I'm going to try finally it anyway because screwing up the stack would be bad. So I should be able to say context is a new test context. New test context. Test is the test. Test case state is I forgot to rename that, by the way. Seems like I forgot to rename that. All right. So then there's test state. Test state dot whatever. And we need a new one of these. And then test output helper. It's not normally where we new up a test output helper. So part of me wants to go and comment this out for the moment. I mean, I will definitely be putting it back at some point. But right now, I'm just poking around to see how this stuff feels. So I don't want to make that big of a change. All right, test state. All of these are going to be null by default, except we need a status of not started. Interestingly, we're returning back an iTest context here, but we actually want test contexts. Maybe the interface has to go away. Maybe the interface is just annoying, but at the moment, the context has a public setter. So what I want here is like an internal static test context. Current internal would be current. That would be, this would come down here, and you would just be current internal. Right. We have our push and our pop. So we would do test context push our context. We would return create test runner. So that's just that's not the one I want to copy. This is the one I want to copy. Except, that's not really the one I want to copy either. Just trying to save myself a little. Okay, so except you just get the regular aggregator. You don't get the new wrap. You don't need to be wrapped. Turn create test runner. And finally, I need to do test context pop to get my test context out. That seems like the earliest I could do it. Except this is an XUnit test case runner. Is there a way for me to do this in test case runner? Let's see. So run test async gets called here. We don't have a test yet. So I can't really do it here. All right, because your job is just to run something and give me the summary back. Oh. So you don't even have the real sort of test case here. Test case is an test case. That's okay then. Maybe this doesn't belong in the test case runner then. Maybe it actually belongs down in test runner. Because I don't want this to be just XUnit, right? I want this to be anybody who overrides the infrastructure. So this is all, wrong. We'll go take it elsewhere. So if I go to test runner, you are run async for a test. And you have test somewhere. All right, you have test. It's interesting it's iTest and not tTest. But I guess T is for the test case. Okay, that's fine. If this allows to attach files, I can finally have it. So I did mention that earlier, Inker. This is necessary to enable that functionality. Because this is where, the attaching process would live. But that's not what I'm working on today. Just working on getting the infrastructure and see how I like it. Okay, so this has a test. And this run async, public async, run async. It's not a virtual. So maybe this code actually belongs here. And if I were to do that, that would be that. So test starting. So at the point that we have posed test starting, so this is skipping, this is passing, skipping, failing. So once we send the test starting message, I think actually probably the place where we would say context status, context test state status is running. All right. And then if you got skipped, we do skipped, and then we want to fill in information here. So interesting that skip reason isn't in my test context. All right, let's just make some fresh space up here at the top. Should skip reason be in the test state? I feel like it probably should. But we're also going to do this. We need output to be empty. Actually, what we really want to do is we want to come down here and just use the values from test skip. I think. Anything else in here need to be set. So those are null because we're not failed. Failure cause also null because we didn't fail. Output we set, status we set, execution time needs to be 0. O and S. Okay, so that's skipped. Okay, and then we your aggregator run async, invoke test async. So this is, we're still running here, but after this is awaited, we won't be running anymore. This should give us our run summary time and our output. So here for passed, that means this is passed. This output is test result output, although some of these things looks like we can probably put right here. I think that's probably it in terms of what's common. So passed is just passed. Skipped is just skipped. And then failed is failed. The exception messages is going to be test result. Except, of course, I don't have them because, of course, test result is not actually a test failed. Okay, we're going to flip this around then. Exception messages is this. So I only want to do these things once. Exception parent indices, context, test state, parent indices, exception types, context, test state, exception types, and I also probably want to get rid of all these accessors for context test state. All right. Okay. So I'll just do test state. test state. Okay. All right, let's continue here. Execution time. Is that state output is output. Failure cause. We don't have a failure cause, do we? Well, that's interesting. Failure cause is something we evaluate outside. But what if we pushed it into test failed? Oh, we do have it there. Cause is there. Oh, we don't set it here though. How weird. Oh. Ah, we set it here. It's interesting that we're newing up a test failed, but not using this helper. Because we need an exception to do that. At this point in time, we don't have an exception. We do have an exception. It's right there. What am I talking about? I'm right there. Oh. And then that's where the logic is for test time and assertion exception. My guess is that I'm not going to find any other setters of cause other than maybe tests. Right? Right. So I found no other setters of cause other than tests. Which makes me feel like I should be using this. Okay, how about this? Test failed is test failed from exception. EX assembly unique ID collection unique ID class unique ID method unique ID case ID test ID execution time, which I stole to come over here, and then output. Test result is test failed. Oops, I stole that in the wrong place. So execution time. Which, by the way, didn't need to be there anyway. Okay. The fact that we have potentially output here with the dynamic skip makes me think about a comment I wrote about output in test state. Which looked something like returns the output from the skipped tests usually have no output. So dynamically, statically skipped tests, for example, those that use fact attribute dot skip, will have empty output. Let's see. Dynamically skipped tests may have output that's done before the dynamic skip was invoked. Okay. That's just some extra docs. All right, back to test timer. So there's my test fail, there's my test result. Here's my test state. We don't care about output. We don't care about execution time. We do care about status. Now all these should come from test failed. Test failed, messages. Test failed. Parent indices. Test failed. Exception types. By the way, we're not going to need error metadata anymore. I can see that already. You're already using error metadata extract to extract the metadata, right? Right. And then failure cause is going to be test failed cause and status. So anything else needs to be set on test state. So we got, oh, I'm missing stack traces. Okay, so there's the 4 things for exceptions. 1, 2, 3, 4. Execution time and output are common. Failure cause we did. Output is common. Status is failed. Okay. So there's that. So if you're skipped, then you're skipped. Passed, you're passed. The only things you care about are execution time and output, which we pull down here. We send that message, we clear the aggregator, we run all the cleanups, run test finished, and then we pop the test context back out. Okay. That looks like the right place to do this, in my opinion. I'm not sure if this is just going to be static accessor based, which is my leaning based on the mutation stuff I was talking about earlier. I don't think the interfaces are adding any value. Because if I have to go through the static accessor to get this thing, it's just going to be one of those. And I'll just mark the setters as internal and be done with it. Maybe. All right. But I'll leave it there for the moment. It's not hurting anything. Okay, so given this now, I have one of these, which means I can go get one from a test, which means I can now test that this stuff works. So the first place I want to test this is in test runner tests, right? Because obviously I'm working on test runner. Let's split you over here. All right. Messages, passing, failing, skipping, output, blah, 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 blah. So essentially, these are all tests against run async, is what I'm seeing here. Makes sense. It's pretty much the only API to this thing, right? Oh. It's a very meta moment of testing where you're like, I should just go test the value of testContext.current, but of course, testContext.current is going to be something now. All right, is that the test? Let's go down to the bottom. So that's test context. I mean, right? Small comment, of course. You need to be commented out too, buddy. Oh, core tests, not core. Okay, passed. Go format everything since we have apparently some mix of carriage returns and line feeds going on here. Just that one file. So let's do that. Make sure that's not null. So the status. You should be running. Okay, then test. Sure we have that. Display name. And it's going to be, you know, this. Suppose I could construct. So motivated to survive renames. Okay. So now we have a test context. It's only for tests, it's not for anything else. What else can we look at after test starting called? After test starting callback aggregator. Test starting callback aggregator. So you can do that. And then we'll do before. So like, what are the times? Test if it's set correctly and disposed. Yeah, that's definitely something I want to do too. I think what I was thinking was there are moments through here where the status changes, right? So like statically skipped test shows up as skipped. And so like what we've been doing is like after test starting, before test finished, invoke test async. Like we could capture some of the values here to make sure that the values are correct. Makes sense to inject context. So yeah, so I had a conversation about this on stream a little earlier. I think yeah. So the problem I have with injection is there are. I mean, you could sort of go back and review the longer version, but I'll give you the 30-second version. There are basically 7 levels of the execution engine, right? Executing the assembly, the test context, test class, the test method, the test case, and the test, I guess 6, not 7. So there are 6 states for this test context, and if we intend to have these test contexts available at various states here, then what happens with injection is that the instance that I give you during injection will have to be mutated as we go through the process. And I'm not really fond of that design. I think instead what I've done, and I'm willing to admit that maybe this is a bad take, but instead what I've done is I have a stack of test contexts. And the intention is that every time you hit one of those new layers, we just make a new test context with more information, right? The top or the bottom of the stack, I should say, will be the test context that only knows about test assembly. And then the one that sits above that will be the test context that knows about test collections as well. The test collection you're in, the one above that's the test class you're in, et cetera, et cetera. And so I think, like having this sort of a stack-based approach makes more sense, but it sort of makes injection not work. You mean that test context state and constructor not equal to test context state and dispose? What I mean is, like for example, right now, all you have access to is information about the test, but imagine that I also had test case, and I test method, right? And I test class. And these were available if you are currently in the context of a test case, that will be a value that's available. And if you're not, it won't, right? So just like this here says, hey, this could be null. Even though I don't really know a context in which this one would be null, but at the moment, right? But now if you think about going up a level to test case, to see if I'm in the middle of doing things that are test case related or test method related or test class related and I don't have a test yet, that's when test would be null, right? And so this object, if it has that whole stack of 6 stuff, then I would have to mutate the object that I gave you in your constructor as you were going through the engine process to say, okay, well now we're in a test case, so I'll mutate the test case value to not be null anymore. And when the test case is over, I'll mutate it back to be null again. Whereas with the static accessor, what we basically will say from a contract perspective is you can not count on that returning the same value every time you call, because the context in which you call it might give you a different test context, right? If you're running in a test, you'll get a test context that has access to a test. But if you ask for a test context outside of a test, you won't have access to that test anymore. So, yeah, I'm not 100% sure, but I'm going to go down this static accessor path at the moment and sort of see if that is, you know, like, look, I hate statics. Okay, I write a test framework. Of course I hate statics. I hate trying to test this right now because, in a sense, you just can't, like, you are observing yourself. Like, that's a tough one to do. But at the same time, you know, hey, it is what it is, right? Okay. So I have test state and I have a test. Test state we can decorate with not null if not null. Test, which means don't have to do that anymore. Or apparently I do. It's interesting. Oh, you know why? I know why. Because it's on iTest context and not test context. That's actually a different one. Yeah, that actually doesn't do what I would hope it would have done. Bummer. I mean, there's no harm in putting these things here. But if they're not going to do the job, then they're not going to do the job. Well, I'll leave it. You would get one of those too. Okay. And you would get one too. Okay. Alright. So then there's the test there, and there's a test state. Because I'm running, that's really pretty much the only other thing I can look at. I mean, I can validate that all these other things are null. Probably nothing wrong with that. I think that's it. Yep, that's it. Alright, so Andreas, perhaps you could inject something that gives you the context, like an test context accessor, when you ask it, instead of directly injecting the context. You do that in ASP.NET Core with HTTP context. Yeah. Yeah, that's true. You inject an accessor instead of the other thing. It would essentially be this same code, just not static anymore. Right? This stack of stuff would exist in the accessor. Throw that in my notes. Okay. So back to my tests. What other things can I look at? Like in terms of the status, do we call anything with the status of not started? Test starting. When we send the test starting message, that's where we are, but we would basically need to watch the message bus, and at the moment that it saw the message, take a look at the test context status. It's not super exciting. After test starting, we could wait to say running until we actually go to run it. Right? Because here we haven't actually started running yet. So when after test starting, we should be able to take a look at the status. So let's do that. Public test status. After test starting status. Surprised you don't yell at me about that not being set. Probably because we don't have nullables here, do we? No, nullables enabled. Whatever. So after test starting status, we need to go down to after test starting and stash that. Test context current test state status. We know these things to be true. Can implicitly convert a test status into a test status. Did I not make that nullable? I guess I didn't make that nullable. I changed my mind, huh? So where are we looking at after test starting called? That is here. Installation test starting does not blah, 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 blah. This is when we have test passed, test failed, test skipped, test finished. This is a reasonable place to be able to say test status dot not started. Okay. Let's see more comments from Inker. I think 99% of people want is just to detect the test failed centrally and react to that, perhaps by attaching a file or writing something more detailed. For this, even an interface, I notify result kind of thing would work. Yeah. Maybe. I mean, that's something to think about. All right. What else? Probably want to look at before test finished status. All right. And then before test finished, running. All right. Or not. Where does... Oh no, that comes all the way down here. So that's the actual result. So we're going to need an extra parameter here, which is going to be test status dot test status dot failed test status dot skipped. And then for test finished, oh. Now I'm wondering if this is the right place for this. Now I'm looking at this and going, this is about cancellation. Maybe this isn't the right place for this. Alright, let's move you guys. Let's roll this up. Just passing, failing, skipping, output. Maybe they belong in here. Well, what's messages? So these are the message bus messages. Pass, fail, skip will be tested elsewhere. Okay. So really nothing here that matters. Passing, pass message, statuses, passed. Okay. Failing. We failed. Here we will get skipped. All right, all of that is true. Should probably should we be pulling exception information out of here? We test to make sure exception types get set at least. Yeah, maybe. You are a string question, bracket question. No. No. Then same thing here. I do feel like we should be grabbing some other stuff out of here too. Don't know if I can bring the whole test state with me. I think I can, actually. Maybe that's just what I should do. Because here at the end, we know that this is from, oh, you need to do that anymore. All right. So we should be testing other values in here too. Empty. So this should be null. This should be null. This should be null. This should be null. That should be that. This should be null. That's empty. Why are you upset? Because it might be null. Yeah. Fine, we'll do it like this. It's fine. Sure. That's everything in the state, right? Not running, so everything not running. There's really no other state that matters. All right, so this is failing, so this should be failed. Output is empty, it's still the same execution time, except This is not null. That's not null. That's not null. That's the types. I guess that was also not null. I don't need that. I need this. Except I already have that. Okay. Let's copy this again one more time for skip. And you're 0 in now. Okay. Assertion null asserts. Or 101. Let's see. You should be able to be failure cause assertion. Because you came from true exception. It's true. Okay. And we've got output. Which means let's just do output. So the output got in there. Okay. Q test is non-Q test, is not invoke test. Sure, this is all received exception, returns test failed, no clean up failure message. Yeah, none of this matters to me. No clean up failure, no, does not include exception for after test starting. Okay, that's all fine. Cancellation, that's all fine. This test feels very superfluous now. We're essentially testing that elsewhere. Well, except we don't test this anywhere. Except for here. Yeah, it's fine. I'll leave it. Okay. So that gets me a static test context. That feels like a good commit point. First of all, let's add and stash. Switch to dev. Make sure dev is up to date with main. Static test context. All right, GPG, wake up. Good job. Let's make sure all that stuff works. Actually, before we get into that, let's do my format again. And let's also throw up git k so we can review it. Yep, that's not what I wanted to do. Stop. Build. Okay. So what have we got here? So we're using XUnit internal. Guess that's because we need access to Oh yeah, because test context itself is still an X unit internal, isn't it? Yeah. It's okay. That's why it's a work in progress. Right. So on a passing test, we get not started in the beginning, and then afterwards we have no exceptions. We have an execution time, we have no failure cause, we have an empty output, and we're in a pass state. Failing, we haven't checked everything else. We did check exception types. I do kind of feel like, oh, well, we had a big failure, so I guess we're not done yet anyway. I do kind of feel like I want to do more than that. I wonder if I do same. Maybe I can do equal. Probably do equal, right? So I should be able to say, I expect that to be equal to failed to be equal to failed messages. All right, is that true? Okay. Failed. So your parent indices, your stack traces, and your types. So this is going to be parent indices, stack traces, exception types. Okay. So I like that a little bit better. Okay, so what happened all the way down here? Trying to pop. 354. Trying to pop. We fail. Why do we fail to pop? Like the pop, test runner 354. Is in a finally immediately after a push. This is an async local on a stack. There's no try pop on this either, is there? Nope. So an async local that basically gets allocated right here should basically always be the same value. The thing that's really confusing is, like, we finish running all the tests, and then we get a stack empty? test framework executor, test framework executor, test framework examiner, test assembly runner, actually test assembly runner, test collection, test collection, test class, test method, test case, test runner. Like, yeah, that's the stack of stuff. You await aggregator run async. So why does that work? Is it because it's .NET Core? No. Very confused. I'm in the middle of mucking with source files and something got in a weird state. I really don't know. We're down to running V2 and V1 tests now, so I don't imagine we're going to have any other issues. Yeah, that was weird. Let me amend that commit. We'll go take a look at it again. Okay. Don't like the fact it's internal, but that's just weird namespace for the moment. Still sort of leaving the description, the decision of injection versus static for another moment. All right. So this is test status. Not started. Yeah, okay. So there's passing, there's failing, there's skipping, there's output, there's basically a self-check. Am I currently running? I think I am. Okay, and then here's our test context. Test state and test state, exception messages, parent indices, stack traces, exception types, execution time, failure cause, output, and status. And then there's our context, which is basically just the static stack. Push pull. Test runner, yeah, we're going to need to ignore space changes there. That was basically just a giant indent for the try finally. Up here, this test state with skip, this first skip. This one. It is interesting that we have this test result. It just kind of hangs out, right? And all of this logic basically the same. But what we really want is this test result. And then we want this. Because we queue a test skipped. We didn't check for cancellation, which is okay. So that seems like a bug. That's why I don't like having this twice. Okay. Test result comes out up here. Right, and then this becomes, test result is this. And then you're that. And you don't have that. And these all move out here. Okay, good. Okay. Please that. Let's go back and look at that again. That's test runner now, all right? We hoisted test result. We pushed it there. We move that down. We just set the state. Otherwise, the state is running. We run it. Here the state is passed. Here the state is skipped. And here we have redone the way we do fails. Use the factoring method, which is what we should have done in the first place. That's why it's there. And this common code got moved out here, and then this got just basically moved out a level. And then our final. Okay, that seems like a reasonable place for a static version of this. What are things related to tests that should be able to see the test context that also need to be tested? Is really the next question. So like before, after tests attributes, right, should have access to the test context. All right. Before, after test attribute tests. Well, this is the next unit 2 message adapters. Spy before after test. Okay, who uses you? This gets tested in the Invoker. So here is all of our messages. Before test starting, before test finished. After test starting, after test finished. And our spy before after test, which is never used here. Thrown before, then throw. Thrown after, throw. We probably want the state. Right? Oh. We actually need to clone the test state, right? Because the test state is definitely mutating. Which is ironic because here I was talking about how I didn't like mutation, and I just want to have mutated things up front anything, but guess that's what we should do? This mutation versus not mutation thing is always a weird one for me, right? Because I'm constantly thinking about what are the performance implications of every object I new up, right? In terms of how much time, how much memory pressure that adds when we're running tests. So I can imagine that newing up a new test state every time to say, hey, by the way, this is your new test state, wouldn't be the best. On the other hand, like the not started in a running versions could be statics that we keep, static instances, because they never change, right? So I either need clone capability here and everywhere that I test it, or I need it to be immutable. It's actually not a bad idea. What if this thing was immutable, right? So if it was immutable, then I'd need constructors factory methods. Something. Just do a private constructor. I'm thinking about this, like if I really want to go down this immutable path, like for real, then that means that I should actually be swapping out the context. Because if somebody stashes that context, what should you be able to count on if you hold on to that context object? Contractually, we can basically just say never do that. Or if things were immutable, then we could say when you get it, you're basically getting a snapshot of a moment in time that's guaranteed not to change. But two subsequent calls to, test context.current aren't going to necessarily return the same object, because if the state has changed, you're going to get a new object. This is a good question. This is a question I want to leave until later. I am definitely leaning in this direction, thinking about it. Problem is, I want to make this. I want to make a decision. I don't want to make a decision. I don't really know, except I can't. I can't do this without knowing what that's going to be, because I have to know here whether I need to clone things or not. But for sure, if I'm going to have these push pop, I need a swap as well. We'll do that right now, right? Swap, test context, pop, push. Basically just give me a pop and push one-liner. Yeah. Yeah, I think I want to go down this immutable path. Because once again, I think this decision is orthogonal from the decision of whether or not we have a static accessor to get the current context, or we use an accessor function to get the context. Either way, when I've been given a context, what should I be able to assume about it? Which is that it's a moment in time. Here it is. When I give it to you, that's the state it is. It will never change. Its state should always be consistent. Right? And the only way to guarantee that we have consistent state is to make things not mutable. And given the number of things that we assign over in our test invoker, our test runner, given the number of things that we would assign, yeah, okay, I could see how this is, you can get yourself into an inconsistent state. So if I'm going down that path, then we go to test state, which is just where I was. Let's go ahead and Z these back into existence. rather than taking these, like one of the things we could do, whoops, sorry, test adapter, test runner, thank you. All right, these could take things like this, like test starting. Well, not test starting, like test skipped. I could take a test result message. What are my... go to implementations of test result message. So we got failed, finished, passed, skipped. We could take a test result message and just basically switch on type. Actually, failed is probably the only one we care about, right? Because we know that skipped and passed don't really have anything interesting in them. Let's take a look at what that looks like. So execution time comes from here. Output comes from here. Status we have to get from the type. Switch. What a switch expression. I can never remember to write them off, how to write them off the top of my head. I know if I do it like this, actually I'm just going to do it like that anyway. Parameter name, test result. Then we can go over to test runner and we can steal all of this stuff, basically. This stuff right here. These all become private setters. And we're going to want a couple of static versions. Oh. Surprised that I'm not getting complaints about not setting that value in the constructor. Okay. I'm going to have that as a test result. That's my test state. So that means I come back over to test runner. And I don't do any of this. Can't set status to running. I'm aware of that. Can't do that. Can't do that. Actually, don't need any of this anymore. That goes back to where it was. I don't need that. What I do need, however, is context test state from test result. That get that. So I think what I want for test state is a couple of statics. Not passing. I meant not started and it's going to be running. So then here, test state is going to be test state not started. We're fine. And then here, we're going to say context test state is test state running. All my tests should still pass, right? Yep. And now test state is immutable. Let's do the same thing with test context. Test context is immutable. Maybe I don't actually need pop. Maybe I don't actually need a stack. I don't know. We'll see. I'm going to leave the stack in here for now, though. So the stack, push, pop, swap. So we need another private constructor, right? You go up top. Okay. Then we want basically test context for test, which will take an I test, test, and a test state for test state. Test is the test state is the test state. Go ahead and guard these. Okay. Now we got some red over here. We're not going to stash the context anymore. Instead, we're going to say test context push, test context test, test and test state not started. Put static on that, huh? That's a swap. To running. And that's a swap to the test result. One, two, three, 1, 2, 3. Okay. Now everybody's immutable. Okay. If we look at these changes, I think they just get rolled up into the last commit again. Except for this spy before after test, which can't use yet. Test context becomes immutable. Test state becomes immutable. Test runner uses the immutability. Alright, so let's add this. Visual Studio just loves to put curlifs in things, despite me telling you not to fucking do it, Visual Studio. Alright, we'll say whip, make context and test state immutable. Okay. Now all we've got left is spy before after test. which we were going to start stashing this stuff. And actually, we're going to do test context. Because we can do that now. Test context current. Oh. All right. Want these things out of the internal namespace right now. I really do. You can have empty summaries for the moment. Test runner. Still need internal for guard. Just don't need it for test context anymore. Why is there a blank line there? It's weird. So that'll try finally if I gave back a disposable that pops. But whatever. Okay. How's everybody? Run all the tests. Test is an ambiguous reference between test-driven.framework.testDate and xnu.v3.testDate. Oh. Result sync tests. One, two, three. There's the fourth one. So we're ready to build now. Okay. Here we are again. Stack empty. By the way, stack traces in .NET Core, much better. You don't see this constant embedded async nonsense. Why? Why do we get into a situation where maybe when we try and pop, it's not valid anymore? And it's only after we're done. Only after we're done. I really don't understand how this could possibly be. Yeah, I'm very confused by this. I'm tempted to put some extra logic in here. I don't even want to put it in debug because I haven't seen it locally yet. It'll be happening in release. Console right line. Failed to pop test context. Hang up for test. Test. Well, the problem is, yeah, I don't have access to that. I mean, I know what the call stack is, right? I'm in test runner. Maybe I should put the try catch there. Actually, I want to do this with debug config. Invalid values specified in configuration. Odd values of debug and release. Really? Oh, yeah, okay. Double dash. Well, let's go grab our command line from way up above. Actually, there's no point in grabbing that. I don't want to actually do all that. No need to build. Let's go dashing it. There we go. Well, I mean, that's what I expect, right? Is there a way to dive into all the different async local values that have been set? Don't know. I feel like if that's going to be the case, it's going to be in threads view, maybe? Tasks view, maybe? Tasks. Hey, cool, none. So there's threads. thread are we on? We're on this one right here. I'm trying to remember where this stuff is stored. Execution context? Alright. Context of the current thread, yeah, okay. Local context value returns null. Async local context value. Async local context value. Yeah, we don't have value there. What is async local context? Back here again. Oh, async local context is some local in his sample. I'm an idiot. Pay close attention. Not an obvious thing to understand, but here's the explanation. Control flow in async programs. This is how your thread is changed when you do not expect this. None of this should matter. Async local of T updates down the chain are not reflected in upstream methods. That's actually a good point I hadn't considered. Like, I don't think we need a stack. Because if it only matters where I am now, then that change is going to erase up above me. Which means I don't really need the stack. I'm going to avoid this problem but really in an ugly way. By getting rid of the stack. Now it puts these factory methods in a weird state where I don't think I need them anymore. Because I can just do a setter here. And he'll manufacture one and then set it. Yep, that's exactly what I'm going to do. Oh my. Rid of the stack. Spawn our tests. All right, so I had come into the SPI before after because I needed to make changes to the Invoker tests, right? Those messages. Execution order. Let's see. Recording before after. Okay. So we have messages and execution order. So we have successful messages. Failed before. I guess what this really means is Invoker run async. This obviously doesn't set anything because it's test runner that sets everything. But it's before and after stuff is done inside the test invoker. So the only way that we would actually see the test context is if we were running in the context of test runner. If I were to just look at the test context that came through here, they would be the ambient test context of this test itself. Because this invoker doesn't set that stuff up, it doesn't really matter. Not much value in me just setting a test context and saying that that test context is sitting there. Maybe this test that I put over in test runner tests, or they actually test? No, they were test run tests. This probably doesn't belong here anymore. What I really need is some test context tests. Should these be v3? That's a good question. Everything else up here is in X unit. Everything here is in X unit. Alright, I'm going to take a note of that. Okay, we did that. Should test context and friends be in X unit or X unit? Okay. So there's that. Override before. Override after. I'm going to have to leave these as static. Fortunately, how do I do this? Yeah, do it as like an acceptance test. You can put that on the assembly, method, or class. I think I can use the SPY here, right? SPY before, after. No, I think I'm going to go back. These changes out. Let's see. We have run looking for specific message types. It can be messages. Yeah, I don't really care, right? On async type of test with before after. You did not see a context. That's interesting. Did you actually get called, though? Never got called. Why? Why? Why did you never get called? Yeah. Huh. You get called? You did not. Because I'm dumb and I didn't put fact on there? Hey, look at that. Okay, so the before context should be not started. Passed afterwards. Oh, we're already running. Okay, that's fair. Oh, we still show running on the way out. Because of the order in which we do before and after. We still see running on the way out. We don't know whether or not the thing actually failed or not. Makes sense. Why do we separate test invoker from test runner? Base class provides a default behavior to invoke a test method. This includes support for async test methods as well as creation and disposal of the test class. I guess Y is before and after attribute stuff here. Creates a test class unless the test method is static or there have already been errors. Note this method takes times the creation test class using timer. It's also responsible for setting test class construction starting and test class construction finished. Typos. Override this method without calling the base. You're responsible for all of this behavior. This method should never throw. Any exceptions should be placed into the aggregator. Makes sense. So because all of this is here, like I don't get to see the status in the before and after attributes. So you create the test class. This test method. Don't use that. Fine with all of that. Before invoke and after. Suppose. So this is the other part of the problem too, right? Which is the things that I see during construction and disposal are wrong. Our constructor says we're already running because of where we put that code. It's not technically true. Or is it? I don't know. Is running a constructor part of running a test? Maybe it is. But the point is, dispose happens here, which means I absolutely cannot see any other result coming out. Because we're immutable, if I were to try and set the status here, I wouldn't see it back up the chain. Like I'd see it everywhere here, but I wouldn't see it anywhere up the chain. There's a little before and after attribute stuff. Why did I think that was done in Test Invoker? Oh, it's an XUnit Test Invoker. Of course. Not Test Invoker. Test case runner has a list of these things. It isn't given a list of these things, so it must create them somewhere. So the XUnit test case runner is the one that comes up with the list. Oh. Just had a thought. What context am I actually looking at? I bet I'm looking at the wrong context. No. That actually looks okay. So it must be XUnit test invoker. It's actually calling the before and after attributes. And in fact, look at that. It is. For test method invoked async. We need to do that. That is called in test invoker. Here. So really, like, right here, we need to update the context with the new state. It's a really inconvenient place to have to do it. Like, really, really inconvenient. Oh. I might need to think on this one. I'm not sure what the answer to this one is yet. Because clearly this isn't just about before and after. It's also about construction and, just as important, disposal. Right? We need the correct state to be visible to dispose. Otherwise, there's sort of no point in this. This is really where people want to care about this most, is in dispose. Not too bothered by the fact that it says running in the constructor, because sure, if you fail the constructor, you fail the test. That's running. We're running your code. Yeah, this is a noggin thinker. Yeah. All right. Well, I think that's going to do it for today. I know I'm sort of leaving us on a cliffhanger. Sorry about that. I knew I wasn't going to get this all done today. I'm glad we got something working. It's obviously not the right something yet. Maybe this code belongs down here in Test Invoker instead of up in Test Runner. Maybe Test Runner is the wrong place for it. Maybe Test Runner should just have the not running or the not started version. And then down here, we do running and then the parsing. But of course, the parsing is kind of an interesting problem, right? Because the aggregator is going to have our exceptions in it. And the test runner, see, I realize I'm typing now and you can't see it. Let me go back to the window. All right, the test runner, we pull this test message, obviously. I mean, I just made that change. Say, hey, this is good. We pull all that stuff out of the exception there. If I was up here and I just had the exception, I'd have to break the exception apart again. Yeah. I feel like maybe the code just belongs down here, but I want to think on it. Brain's starting to hurt. I need a break. So that's why I'm going to take a break. Thanks for hanging out with me, Andreas Inker, and then anybody else who's lurking today. Or if you're watching this after the fact, thanks for watching. Leave some comments on what you think is going on here, and any of your opinions on, do you like or hate the statics? Do you like or hate, injection? Should we do one or the other? Should we do both? Because obviously we're not even close to making a decision yet, but I feel like the machinery is coming into place. This is the matter of finding the right moment at which to set that machinery in motion. All right, anyway, thanks for hanging out today, and I'll see y'all next time.